Hey, I'm Andrew Malcolm from Mortgage HQ, and I've got Andrew Bailey here. He's Minister of Parliament with National. So you used to be an investment banker, right?
Well, amongst other things, yes, you say that in such a way, Andrew.
Well, look, your LinkedIn profile does give a lot of good details, but I'm sure it was a long and storied career. Do you want to tell us any of the highlights?
Actually, I was the youngest investment banker a long time ago. I'm a bit older than I look. I joined a company called Southpac, which was back then the preeminent sort of merchant bank in New Zealand. And I did a lot of mergers and acquisitions. Went to London, worked there for about 6 years. We used to float a company every week. Worked on some of the world's biggest privatizations, including the water companies. So the three waters that we're currently going through in New Zealand, I worked on that project in London or England for 2.5 years. So we took council operations, corporatized them, and then floated them on the London Stock Exchange. Anyway, I've probably floated about 25 companies, done
Yeah.
and advised on a lot on mergers and acquisitions. But merchant bank we had offices in New Zealand and Australia, and more recently Singapore, and used to do a lot of corporate advisory, strategic work as well as mergers and acquisitions.
I mean, it's one of the reasons I like following you on, following along the speeches you make and on LinkedIn is because I know you've got a history of competence in business and you understand the economy, you understand on how to get things done. You're not an academic, so to speak. You've actually done a lot of this stuff. And when you throw your opinion into the ring, it's from a place of, you've been there, done that. It's actually a qualified opinion.
Hey, well, thank you for that. The main thing, people don't realize, and particularly many of the current ministers, is they don't understand what cash means to a business. They just do not have an understanding what cash means to a business.
Yeah, and with small business owners making up the majority of the moving money in the economy, especially hit hard during these times, and then you compound the damage with this triple CFA change that's come in and making it harder for those people that are good at taking risk and starting a business. They want to borrow money to acquire assets to help grow and support the economy even more. And now they are having more trouble because of these changes with triple CFA borrowing money for what they deem to be good investments.
You sound like a politician, Andrew. Maybe there's a role for you.
Well, I think that the spokesperson role you have at National, read off a couple of the things. So you're talking about building and construction, commerce, consumer affairs, manufacturing, revenue tax side of things, and small business. I mean, this is right in your wheelhouse. There's no one more perfect to talk about triple CFA. How did we get here?
Well, very good question. So, obviously, the financial markets are highly regulated. So you have what's called regulated financial institutions, which are your banks and your credit societies, are all highly regulated by the Reserve Bank. We also now have what's coming into play, conduct of financial markets, another bill which will be regulated by the FMA. So, and I'll talk about that conflict later on. But what transpired is all of us in Parliament were increasingly aware of truck stop operations that would go down to poor parts of our electorate. In fact, I used to chase them around Pukekohe and down to places like Kingseed. And they'd turn up and basically try and flog off vacuum cleaners that were worth $100 and flog them off at $200 and charge, 70% interest when you looked at it. And so we all came together and said, well, look, we want to do something about that. And that was the focus of this original triple CFA bill. And that's why we all agreed to it, all the parties agreed to it. There was provision in the legislation, and we were pretty clear at the time, because the banks had said there were some issues around how it might operate. But if you look at the actual legislation, it provides for a differential approach between banks, or it says lenders, but effectively what that means is you could have a differential approach between, regulated lenders like banks, as opposed to our truck stop operators on the other side. What then transpires, you spend a lot of time doing legislation and select committee, and it got passed, and then what happens next is it goes to the officials and they write the regulations.
Okay, yeah.
And this is the occasion, and we're always worried about what's in regulations, because unfortunately, the regulations never come back to the select committee. And what's happened is the officials have gone berserk on the regulations. And we've had a minister who's not been across the detail. This is where you need a really good minister who's well aware of the arguments, who can say to the officials when they come up with these regulations, well, why are you doing that? That was bowled out at a select committee, or what? And that didn't happen. And basically, particularly when you have transfer of ministers, so we had Chris Farfoy, who was a minister, and then got transferred to David Clark. I don't know where the problem lay, but what's happened is these bloody regulations have been a shocker. And then, of course,
let me ask you while we're on that point, the officials, are they non-partisan? Is it like a neutral task force?
Okay. Yeah, they meet to. But you know, during the select committee, there's parts that are public and there's parts that are private. And during the private sector, that's when we as MPs test them, and you know, we'll be asking them, well, how are you going to apply this to the banks? And they'll be saying, oh, look at 9E. You know, that gives a differential approach. So you know, you do all that, but your regulations you don't get to see, only the minister does. And then what's happened under this specific piece of legislation is that a responsible lending code was redeveloped. So there was one back in 2017, and I don't know whether you've read that, Andrew, but it was 64 pages long. this new one is 105.
Crazy.
So they chucked in another 40 odd pages, right? And I went through it, and of course, you know, they're all responsible lending, and you know, for a bank, you are subject to a great deal of scrutiny anyway, because you've got the Reserve Bank doing prudential controls. Where we want it is, if you're going to blow it up by another 40 pages, make sure you focus it on the truck stop operators, not on ANZ Bank or BNZ Bank. And unfortunately, what's happened, and then part of that, what's happened is MB was the one advising the committee, and then we've had the responsible code developed, and then we had the Commerce Commission go around late last year during lockdown to around all the banks and saying, these are our expectations. And of course, all the banks have gone, but geez, you know, I've now got, you know, $600,000 fine. I've got a personal fine of $250. So they all then put in place these systems that made it ultra conservative. And, you know, one of the silly things in the the regulations, if you look on page 25, we've got people who want to look at them now on the code, they actually have this diagram which says you must check the last 90 days of transactions, and you must take the higher of your benchmark expenses for a person compared to what they say they spend, right? So it's actually telling banks how to assess risk. Well, that's absolutely ridiculous.
Well,
banks are in the
bank's job is.
Right? And you know, if they get it wrong, they have to do a write-off, and of course that's publicly disclosed. Where we wanted it to be is focused around, we wanted truck stop operators, if I just keep using that term, or high cost lenders. We wanted them to follow proper procedures, and that's the type of stuff we wanted them to use, not banks and credit societies. And that's where we've ended up. And so, you know, the Commerce Commission scared everyone, and of course, then they put it in place. The banks actually asked for more time for it to come into place. They wanted it to come in place not 1st of December, but actually 1st of April this year. But the minister, the brand new minister, newly minted out, keen to, you know, show that he's doing something, said, no, stuff off, we're going to put it through 1st of December, even though a lot of the training had to take place during lockdown, which is not so good.
And the thing is, okay, firstly, I would applaud initiative and urgency from a minister, but if you're going to rush things through, you have to put your name to it and take the blame and the fame. If it goes good, they're great. You can put your name on it, but you can't just say, oh, not my fault kind of thing. It seems crazy to me that there'll be a committee and then it will go to officials to write things up, and then it wouldn't go back to the committee. It just goes straight to the minister. It just all roads leading up to one person seems insane.
Well, it's worse than that, Andrew, I say, because this is one of the issues we've got. Because the committee that's reviewing this code now, and probably, I don't, because I haven't seen the terms of reference, the wider what happened, but it's led by, guess, MB, who wrote the code and wrote the advice committee on the
who watches the watches, right?
So we got MB, and then of course the other people on the Commerce Commission. Well, and they've got FMA and the Reserve Bank and all that sort of stuff. But it was sort of like, let's just throw it back to the people who made them, that we had the issues with. And I don't necessarily blame the officials. They're obviously over the top, but that's where you need a strong minister to say, look, this is not right. But the worst thing, as you were saying about our minister, the current minister, David Clark, is, if you muck up, what would have been better to say is, all right, we've mucked up, we've had unintended consequences, and rather than him, what he's been saying is blaming the banks.
So
he's saying the banks are misinterpreting.
How easy is it for the minister to say, hey, look, we're going to unwind what we've put into stone, we're going to go back to redrafting, we're going to go back to the way it was before December 1st. Can they do that in a day or not?
Well,
is that not practical?
Well, the trouble is the banks have spent 4 or 5 months changing all their systems, training all their staff. So now you've got a cultural issue, right? Because in the legislation, it's 250,000 in individual liability and 600,000, I think.
So do you think that it should be an individual liability for bank directors for these sorts of mistakes or not?
No, I'm not worried about banks so much. I was worried. I'm very worried about high cost lenders, because I think we've got a certain class of lender in New Zealand that is you do not want, right? That's why we capped the interest rate at 50%, and we had long conversation about how you do all that. That should be the focus. And if those people muck up, then I'm very keen that there are punitive fines for them. But use the technical term, the regulated financial institutions, which is a reserve approved group of finance groups, right? As I said, banks, credit societies, all the ones, or actually if you're a finance company and you raise money on the stock exchange, you have to be regulated. So you're part of that financial regulator. Those are the type of people we're not worried about. But this is where it's all gone wrong. So what we did, Nicola Willis and we wrote a piece of legislation, which we said, and I said on the first day when I was approached by this, is I said national work collaboratively with the government to fix this quickly, right? We need to do it, because it's not just about your home owners actually who are struggling to get their first mortgage, but it's actually people trying to get a loan to fix up a car to go to work, which is even more fundamental. But so we said we'll help. That's the first principle. We will work collaboratively with the government, and let's get on with it. The second thing is the legislation, that the bill we propose is saying basically to the minister, look, you can take a differential approach, use it, it's already in the legislation, we'll work with you and just make it happen. And they'll take a little while to separate those types of classes of lenders. That's the issue. They've got to rewrite some of this. But, in the meantime, Rome burns, doesn't it?
Yes, and what happens is you generate a lot of momentum as a result of this in terms of how confident the market is to take action. And if buyers can't take action, the momentum goes the way you don't want it to go, and it's very hard to turn that flywheel back in the other direction. So you have to.
This could come at no worse time. So I'm sure you've got clients who are involved in a home trying to get loans and stuff, who are now checking, the banks are checking their Netflix and all that sort of rubbish that they have to do looking at the last 90 days. But, we've got the Reserve Bank tightened up on the LVRs. And of course, the other thing that Grant Robertson's keen to talk about is debt to income. Now, whenever I was asked about debt to income, my approach was, look, we are open to the idea, but for the main criteria cannot hurt first-time buyers, because the worst thing about debt to income, if that comes into play, and BNZ, for instance, are using it 6 times debt to income sort of on a voluntary basis. So let's say the Reserve Bank brings that in. The way this really makes it hard, so can you afford the mortgage? But what's the mortgage? So on the other side, you've got LVRs, but the debt to income, if you've got a debt to income of six, let's say you're a couple on 100,000, you maximum you can borrow 600,000. Well, the average house in New Zealand is $1 million. That now means you've got to find 400,000 deposit.
Yeah, it's not going to work, and you're going to buy a house in 10 years' time, and the house price is going to be a lot higher.
Well, most people are sort of aiming to have $200,000 deposit. Now, the other thing, this is the other perverse thing that the government's done, of course, is the issue around the bright line test. So if mum and dad say, oh, you've got 200,000, you're short 200, to make it up to 400. I'll give you 200 because I know you can service the 600,000 debt.
Yeah.
But now under the bright line rules, if they put that money in, when the son and daughter buy them out, the mum and dad have to pay capital gains tax on it.
Yeah, and it's just like you said, it's these sorts of changes are happening at the worst time. So interest rates going up, market confidence is down, the economy, whether you want to admit it or not, the economy is definitely feeling the negative effects. So you know, there's probably 10 things happening all at once. Definitely, most people would be silly to bet against a slowing property market this year.
Yeah, interesting what you're saying. I went to have a tire fix on Friday, and I said to the owner, I said, "How's business?" He said it's down 50%. And then I had a call from as a result of these CCCFA, a guy was on my Facebook or one of my things, and so I rang him up. And I said, "How are you going?" He owns 6 restaurants, one of them which he's just closed down in Queen Street. And he employs 150 staff. Can't work. You know, a lot of small businesses are really struggling. And some are doing really well, don't get me wrong. But right now, we've got a lot of struggling people, eh? And the worst thing is that people have been borrowing against their house because you can't get a mortgage or a loan against your business because it's cash flow lending for the banks. So they're borrowing about their house. Now we've got CCCFA coming into play. Or just doubling up all this stuff. You know, as a government, what they should be doing is sitting back and saying, we put in LVRs, well, the Reserve Bank has. Reserve Bank, we're allowing them to do DTIs. We've done the CCCFA. We've got a housing market. We've got, you know, all these different things. What are we going to do just to make it work? You know, and actually sometimes you just need to reflect, and that's where you need a holistic approach. If you're going to make change, and I understand why the government's doing it, but if you're going to make change, you're going to make sure you look at all the aspects to it. So you actually come up with a cohesive policies, and I'm not sure we've arrived at that.
Yes, a lot of unintended consequences still yet to be discovered, and I think that some of them will be a lot worse than the CCCFA, unfortunately. And even if there's quick reaction from the minister on fixing the CCCFA stuff, it's just one of many, many things working against normal Kiwis trying to get ahead financially.
Hey, well, I would say, you know, people listening to this, make sure you're making your voice heard to David Clark. You can email him at Parliament, Facebook, whatever, but I'm not saying bombard him with a whole lot of stuff, but I'm just saying you make sure that he hears this, because I've heard a number of interviews he's given, and unfortunately he's taken the view that it's the bank's view on interpreting the laws.
Yeah.
Well, wow, that's a really, you know.
Banks want to lend money. That's how they make money.
Isn't that what you do a bit of too, Andrew?
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing that over the last sort of 2 or 3 years, and especially in the last 6 months, the amount of hours and the amount of administration work required for each and every client is going up and up and up. And it's very hard to make money on origination of mortgages for the banks and for professionals involved because of the work. You know, it's gone from 8 hours to 20 hours required, and that is going to impact the cost to the client eventually if it hasn't already, because you need the end user to pay most of the time.
Well, that's right, and of course they're not always amenable to that, but maybe what it'll mean is that people will go and get more financial advice to get a mortgage, because it's going to be more difficult, and therefore they'll probably come to mortgage brokers a bit more also. But we've arrived at a place where we don't really want to be at and shouldn't be at. And, you know, ministers need to respond to that type of stuff. And I just hope David Clark stops mucking around and saying it's everyone else's fault, and actually recognise that it's the rules that have been put in place.
So before I let you go, the next 3 months, what do you see unfolding? What are you hoping for?
Well, the other thing that I was going to talk about, and I mentioned it earlier, is the Conduct of Financial Institutions bill that's working its way through the House.
Yeah.
So this is the next series of. So this bill got introduced back into the House in 2018. Bills normally take, unless you do them under urgency, sort of 6 to 9 months in normal time, right? So this has been on the go slow. Well, it's now before the Finance and Expenditure Committee, and it's now about to come back into a second reading, and then it goes to Committee of the Whole. and then it goes to third reading and it's all done and dusted.
Yeah.
So what the next one, this conduct of financial institutions bill. So as recapturing under CCCFA, that was MB and Commerce Commission. This conduct of financial institutions is now being administered by FMA. So it means that the regulated financial institutions have to show the FMA their code of conduct, different code of conduct from what we're talking about one before, another one, right?
Yeah.
So it's going to a different entity. So FMA, which are starting to get up to speed on this, of course, going to say, well, I think that aspect's really important, even though it's not in the responsible code on the other one, right? Yeah. So we've got two, they're going to be accountable for basically two different entities. And by the way, all we're doing is regulating the highly regulated financial institutions, not the ones we were all worried about, which is the high cost lenders. That's only covered under the first one, the CCCFA.
Yeah.
So where we've got and I've made this point, is that our whole regulation of our financial markets in New Zealand is now looking pretty pear-shaped. And you actually need, it would be one of the issues we do when we come in, is actually look at it all and go, look, we're over-regulating the regulated ones, we're under-regulating the high-cost lenders, we've got multiple government entities involved, we've got two sets of codes. Hey, we need to clean this all up. And if David Clark was sort of had any real sort of experience or wanted to do, this is what he should be doing. He should be sitting back and being really strategic about it and actually listening to what people say to him. That's the trouble.
Yeah, when I'm talking with clients, I'm saying, hey, the government changes around interest deductibility and all this CCCFA stuff and everything that's changing right now. You have to imagine that when National gets back in eventually, doesn't matter when it is, that these changes will get reversed if they're bad for investors or the economy. You know, there's a lot of cost being created because of this right now, and it doesn't really help anyone from my point of view at the moment. Well,
you have to ask yourself, what's the first principle? We want people to lend and borrow, right? Prudently, of course.
Yeah.
But secondly, what we want to make sure is those high cost lenders who I use the word usury, which means that they are selling stuff that people don't want at interest rates that are very, very high. And that's what we're focused on, and we've lost the plot on that.
Yeah, the interest rates one's interesting because they charge interest monthly from my understanding. And as long as interest rate is in an annual term, I think it's really easy for even lay people to understand. So if you change that one thing to saying annual interest rate, that's the only thing you're allowed to display, a lot of people would stop right there.
Yeah. Well, we were wanting to see how the legislation worked, what we put in place. And we may have to have another slice of it yet. This is around the high cost lenders. But we made a big step, and it was, I think it was unanimous support across all the political parties for that.
Yeah.
But anyway, a year and a half away, that'll be a job for one of us.
All right. Well, thanks, Andrew. I'll put some links linking back to you, and I'm sure some people will have questions on Facebook.
Yeah, do that. And I'm also on LinkedIn.
Yep. I think that's the best place to find you to follow along.
Yeah, LinkedIn, or my Facebook is Andrew Bailey MP.
Cool.
BAYLY. But anyway, hey, that's good stuff. Hey, wonderful to talk to you, Andrew.
Thanks, Andrew. Cheers, mate. All right.
Okay, cheers. Bye-bye.